There's a library buried beneath the sand. You've been standing on the ground your entire life. Every step you've ever taken, every place you've ever been, every foundation you've ever trusted, it's all been the same ground, the same earth, the same rock beneath your feet. And you've probably never questioned it. Why would you? The ground is just there, solid, permanent, unchanging. But what if I told you that the ground you're standing on right now has a memory? What if the rocks beneath your feet remember a world so alien, so impossibly different from the one you know, that if you could somehow be transported there, you wouldn't recognize a single thing? Not the sky, not the ocean, not the air itself. You wouldn't even recognize the creatures, because they weren't just different, they were the architects of everything that came after, including you. There's a window in time, a stretch of Earth's history that lasted longer than the entire existence of every human civilization combined. Longer than all of recorded history. Longer than the time between now and the building of the pyramids, multiplied over and over again. And in that window, something happened, something quiet, something beneath the surface of ancient seas, something that would eventually allow you to exist. This isn't a story about dinosaurs. This isn't about the ice ages, or the first humans, or even the first animals to crawl onto land. This is about something older, something stranger. This is about the moment when Earth decided to become the planet you recognize. When it drew the blueprints for forests, for backbones, for jaws, for fingers, for breath. This is about the Devonian, and you've probably never heard of it. Pause for a moment. Think about everything you know about the history of life on Earth. You probably know about the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. You might know about the Cambrian explosion, when complex life suddenly appeared in the oceans. You might have heard about the first fish, the first plants, the first animals to leave the water. But somewhere between those milestones, there's a gap, a span of time that doesn't get talked about. A period that sits quietly in the textbooks, overshadowed by the drama of extinction events and the spectacle of giant reptiles. But the Devonian is where it all began. Not life itself. Life was already ancient by then. But the Devonian is where Earth stopped being a barren, hostile rock covered in shallow seas and started becoming something recognizable. Something with forests, with soil, with rivers that carved through mountains, with creatures that had faces, with limbs, with lungs. The Devonian is where the world learned to breathe. It lasted for 60 million years. 60 million. Let that settle in your mind. 60 million years is longer than the entire age of mammals. It's longer than the time since the dinosaurs disappeared. It's a span of time so vast that entire ecosystems rose and fell within it. Mountains formed and eroded. Continents drifted across the face of the planet. Species evolved, dominated, and vanished without a trace. And through it all, the Earth was running an experiment in survival, in adaptation, in possibility. And somehow, across all that time, the Devonian is almost invisible to us. We don't see it when we look at the world around us. We don't think about it when we walk through a forest, or stand on a beach, or watch fish swim in an aquarium. But it's there, in the structure of your bones, in the way you breathe, in the trees outside your window, in the very fact that there is land to stand on. The Devonian is the world you never knew existed, but the one that built everything you take for granted. So let's go there. Not physically, you can't, but we can go in the only way that matters, through the geology, through the fossils, through the deep, silent memory of stone. We can reconstruct it, piece by piece, layer by layer, until we're standing not in the world as it is, but as it was, 400 million years ago, before grass, before flowers, before trees as you know them, before anything you would call familiar. Let's begin. The first thing you need to understand about the Devonian is that Earth was not the blue-green jewel you see in photographs from space. Not yet. It was close, closer than it had ever been before. But if you could float above the planet during the early Devonian, around 420 million years ago, you'd see something strange, something almost right, but not quite. The oceans would be recognizable, vast, deep, blue in some places, green in others, shallow and warm across enormous continental shelves. You'd see currents, you'd see storms, you'd see waves crashing against coastlines. But the land would stop you cold, because it wasn't green. Here and there, along riverbanks and in low-lying wetlands, you might see patches of color, dull greens and browns, mosses, primitive plants clinging to the margins of stone and mud. But step back, zoom out, look at the continents as a whole, and you'd see rust, gray, red, bare rock, dust storms swirling across empty plains, mountains without trees, valleys without grass, rivers cutting through lifeless stone, carrying nothing but sediment to the sea. The land was almost silent. No birds, because there were no birds yet. No insects buzzing through the air, because flight hadn't been invented. No rustle of leaves in a wind, because there were no leaves. Just the whisper of wind over stone, the hiss of sand, the distant rumble of volcanoes, the slow, patient ticking of erosion. But beneath the surface of the ocean, the world was roaring. The Devonian Ocean was not the deep, cold, mostly empty void that covers most of Earth's seas today. It was shallow, warm, crowded. Reefs stretched for hundreds of miles, built not by corals as you'd recognize them, but by strange alien organisms. Stromatoporoids, tabulate corals, creatures that grew in massive colonies, layer upon layer, forming structures so large they rivaled modern coral reefs in size and complexity. And in those reefs, life exploded. Trilobites. You've probably seen their fossils, those segmented armored creatures that look like ancient pillbugs. By the Devonian, they were everywhere, crawling across the seafloor, burrowing into the sand, filtering food from the water. There were hundreds of species, some small enough to fit on your fingernail, others as long as your forearm. They had been around for over 100 million years by this point, and they weren't going anywhere. Not yet. But they weren't alone. Not by a long shot. Brachiopods, crinoids, sea lilies waving their feathery arms in the current, filtering microscopic organisms from the water. Ammonites, coiled and shelled, jetting backward through the water with primitive grace. The ocean floor was carpeted with life, and above it, swimming through the open water, were the rulers of the Devonian seas, fish. Not the fish you know, not tuna or salmon or goldfish. These were the first fish, the pioneers, the experiments, and they were just beginning to figure out what it meant to have a backbone. In the early days, the fish didn't have jaws, said Catherine. They were jawless, agnaphans, creatures that sucked and filtered their food from the sediment or from the water column. They had no teeth, no bite. They looked more like swimming tubes than predators. But they had something new. Something revolutionary, a skull, a brain case, a spinal column made of cartilage or bone. It doesn't sound like much, but it was everything. Because once you have a backbone, you can build on it. You can add muscle, you can add structure, you can add speed. And once you can move faster than everything else, you can start to hunt. And that's exactly what happened. Somewhere in the early Devonian, a lineage of fish evolved jaws. Hinged, articulated, capable of opening and closing with force. Suddenly, instead of sucking up detritus from the ocean floor, fish could bite, they could tear, they could kill. And once that happened, the ocean was never the same. The age of fishes had begun. You've probably never thought about what it means to have a jaw. You use yours every day, to eat, to speak, to yawn. It's so ordinary that it's invisible. But 400 million years ago, jaws were the most powerful weapon on the planet. They allowed predators to exist, not just passive filter feeders or scavengers, but active hunters, creatures that could chase down prey, that could bite through armor, that could dominate entire ecosystems. And the Devonian Ocean became an arms race. The placoderms were the first to truly capitalize on jaws. Armored fish, heavily plated, covered in bony shields that made them look like swimming tanks. Their heads were encased in thick, articulated armor. Their bodies were flexible, muscular, fast. And their jaws were something new. Some placoderms developed jaws lined with sharp, bony plates that functioned like teeth. Others developed jaws so massive, so powerful, that they could crush shell and bone with ease. The most famous of these was Dunkleosteus, and if you've never heard the name, you should have. Dunkleosteus was not the largest fish that ever lived. It was not the longest, not the heaviest, but it might have been the most terrifying. Imagine a creature 10 meters long, 30 feet, covered in armor plating so thick that almost nothing could pierce it. Now imagine that creature's head, a massive, flat skull, with jaws that could open wide enough to swallow a human whole. Jaws that didn't have teeth, but didn't need them, because the edges of its mouth were lined with self-sharpening blades of bone. Guillotine jaws. Jaws that could bite with a force comparable to a modern crocodile. Jaws that could snap shut in 50 milliseconds, faster than you can blink. Dunkleosteus didn't chew its food. It didn't need to. It bit, it sheared, it swallowed, and anything that couldn't escape in time was gone. And Dunkleosteus wasn't alone. The Devonian seas were filled with placoderms. Some were small, skittering along the bottom, feeding on mollusks and worms. Others were mid-sized predators, hunting in packs or ambushing prey from the shadows of the reefs. And at the top of the food chain, there were the giants. The apex predators, the monsters. But here's the thing that should make you pause. Placoderms are gone, completely, entirely, extinct. There are no living placoderms, no descendants, no distant relatives swimming in the oceans today. They ruled the seas for 70 million years and then vanished. Not because they were failures, but because something else came along. Something better, something faster, something more efficient. Sharks. The first true sharks appeared in the Devonian, and they were nothing like the armored, lumbering placoderms. They were sleek, streamlined. Their skeletons were made of cartilage, not bone, which made them lighter, more flexible, faster. They didn't need heavy armor. They didn't need crushing jaws. They had teeth, rows and rows of teeth. Teeth that could be replaced continuously throughout their lives. Teeth designed for cutting, for tearing, for holding struggling prey. And they had something else, something subtle but devastating. They had better senses. Sharks could detect electrical fields in the water. They could sense vibrations from miles away. They could smell blood in concentrations so dilute it would be invisible to any other creature. They were hunters in a way that nothing else was. Precision predators, and once they arrived, the balance shifted. But the Devonian wasn't just about predators. It wasn't just about violence and teeth, and the race to kill or be killed. Because beneath the spectacle of the hunters, something quieter was happening. Something that would matter more in the long run. Fish were learning to breathe air. Think about that. Really think about it. Breathing air is something you do without thinking. Right now, as you read this, your lungs are pulling oxygen from the atmosphere, transferring it into your blood, and expelling carbon dioxide. It's automatic, effortless. But 400 million years ago, it was impossible. Life existed in the water. Oxygen was dissolved in water. Gills extracted it. That was the only way. But the Devonian changed that. In shallow, warm waters, oxygen levels could drop, especially in stagnant pools, in enclosed lagoons, in rivers choked with decaying plant matter. Fish that lived in these environments faced a problem. They couldn't get enough oxygen from the water. So some of them evolved a solution, a simple pouch of tissue connected to the throat, a primitive lung, a way to gulp air from the surface and extract oxygen directly. At first, it was just a backup system, a survival trick, a way to endure low oxygen conditions until the water improved. But evolution doesn't care about intentions. It only cares about what works. And lungs worked, so they stuck around. And over time, some fish started to rely on them more and more. Until eventually, they weren't just supplementing them, they were replacing them. These were the lobe-finned fish, and they had something else that made them special. Fins with bones inside. Most fish have fins made of thin, flexible rays, perfect for steering, for propulsion, but not much else. Lobe-finned fish had fins that were different, thick, muscular, supported by an internal skeleton, bones that articulated, that bent, that could push against the ground. Why would a fish need that? Why would it need fins that could support weight? Because it was learning to walk, not on purpose, not with a goal in mind. Evolution doesn't have goals. But in the shallow, oxygen-poor waters of the Devonian, there was an advantage to being able to move from pool to pool, to drag yourself across a stretch of mud to reach deeper water, to push yourself up onto a sandbar to escape a predator. And fish with strong, bony fins could do that. Fish with lungs could survive the journey. So they did, and over millions of years, those fish started to change. Their fins became stronger, more weight-bearing. Their bodies became more elongated, more flexible. Their lungs became more efficient. And slowly, quietly, without fanfare or drama, they started spending more time out of the water than in it. By the end of the Devonian, some of them weren't fish anymore. They were tetrapods, four-limbed, air-breathing, walking on land. The first vertebrates to leave the ocean, your ancestors. Pause. Think about that. Every mammal, every bird, every reptile, every amphibian, every creature with a backbone and four limbs, including you, can trace its lineage back to a fish that crawled out of a Devonian swamp. a fish that had no idea what it was doing, no concept of the future, no understanding that it was crossing a threshold that would change the history of life on Earth. It just wanted to survive, and in doing so, it invented the land. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because while fish were learning to breathe and walk, something even stranger was happening on the continents. Something quieter. Something that didn't involve teeth or armor or predation. Plants were learning to grow. In the early Devonian, plants were small, tiny, a few centimeters tall at most. They clung to the edges of water. They had no roots, no leaves, just simple stems with spore capsules at the tips. They reproduced the way mosses do, releasing spores into the wind, hoping they would land somewhere wet enough to germinate. But by the middle of the Devonian, something changed. Plants evolved vascular tissue, xylem and phloem, tubes that could transport water and nutrients up and down the stem. Suddenly, plants didn't have to stay small. They could grow taller, they could compete for sunlight, they could spread, and they did. The first forests appeared in the Middle Devonian, but they weren't forests as you know them. These were forests of Archaeopteris, tree-like plants that grew up to 30 meters tall, 100 feet. They had trunks, they had branches, but they didn't have leaves. Not really. They had fern-like fronds, and they didn't produce seeds. They reproduced with spores, like ferns, but they were trees, the first trees, and they changed everything. Because once you have trees, you have shade, and shade means the ground stays moist, which means smaller plants can grow beneath the canopy, which means soil can form, real soil. Not just mud and sand, but a rich, organic layer made of decaying plant matter and fungi and microbes. And once you have soil, you can support more plants, which creates more shade, more moisture, more soil. It's a feedback loop, a cascade, and it transformed the continents. By the late Devonian, the land was no longer barren. There were forests, wetlands, river valleys choked with vegetation, and with the plants came the animals, insects, millipedes, spiders, the first arthropods to colonize the land. They fed on the plants, on each other. They burrowed into the soil, they pollinated, they spread, and behind them came the tetrapods, the first amphibians, still tied to the water, still laying their eggs in ponds and streams, but capable of moving across land, of hunting, of exploring. The Devonian was the moment when Earth stopped being a planet of oceans and became a planet of continents. And when it stopped being a world where life was confined to the water and became a world where life could exist almost anywhere. But there's something you need to understand. None of this was easy. The Devonian was not a paradise. It was not a gentle, gradual transition from one state to another. It was violent, unstable, punctuated by disasters. The climate swung wildly. There were periods of intense heat, periods of glaciation. Sea levels rose and fell. Ocean chemistry shifted. Oxygen levels fluctuated. And through it all, life was constantly adapting, constantly struggling, constantly dying. Because the Devonian ended with a catastrophe, actually several catastrophes. There wasn't just one extinction event at the end of the Devonian. There were multiple pulses, spread out over millions of years, each one devastating. Each one wiping out enormous percentages of marine life. Reefs collapsed, entire ecosystems vanished. The placoderms, those armored giants that had ruled the seas for so long, went extinct. The trilobites, which had survived every extinction event for over 200 million years, were nearly wiped out. They would never recover. No one knows exactly what caused the extinctions. There are theories: volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, shifts in ocean circulation, anoxia, dead zones spreading across the seafloor as oxygen levels plummeted, changes in plant life on land affecting the carbon cycle, triggering runaway climate change. Maybe it was all of them. Maybe it was none of them. Maybe it was something we haven't even thought of yet. What we know is that the world that emerged after the Devonian was different. The seas were quieter, less crowded, the reefs were gone. The giants were gone, but the sharks remained, the bony fish remained, and on land, the forests remained, the insects remained, the tetrapods remained. Life didn't end, it never does. It just changes, it adapts, it moves on. But the Devonian itself was over. And here's the strange part. The part that should make you feel something. The Devonian is invisible to you. You live in a world that the Devonian built, but you never see it. You walk on soil that wouldn't exist without Devonian plants. You breathe air that was transformed by Devonian forests, which pulled carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and released oxygen. You have a backbone because of Devonian fish. You have limbs because of Devonian tetrapods. You have jaws because of Devonian predators. Everything about the structure of life on Earth, everything about the way ecosystems function, everything about the relationship between land and sea was prototyped in the Devonian. But you don't think about it. Why would you? It's too far away, too alien, too removed from anything you can touch or see. And yet, it's right there, in the rocks beneath your feet, in the fossils pressed into stone, in the DNA coiled inside your cells. You are made of Devonian pieces. Let's go deeper. Let's slow down, because there's something about the Devonian that needs to be felt, not just understood. Something about the sheer scale of it, the patience of it, the way it unfolded over timescales that dwarf human comprehension. 60 million years. You can say the number, you can write it down, but can you feel it? Think about the last 100 years. Everything that's happened in your lifetime, in your parents' lifetimes, in your grandparents' lifetimes. All the changes, all the technology, all the history, wars, revolutions, discoveries. The entire modern world, built in a single century. Now multiply that by 1,000, that's 100,000 years. Still nothing compared to the Devonian. Multiply it by 10,000, 1,000,000 years. The entire span of human evolution, from the first Homo sapiens to now, is only about 300,000 years. 1,000,000 years is longer than our entire species has existed. Now multiply that 1,000,000 years by 60, that's the Devonian. In that span of time, you could fit the entire history of human civilization 600 times over. You could watch the pyramids rise and fall, watch Rome conquer and collapse, watch empires bloom and wither 600 times. And you still wouldn't be close to the end. And through all of that time, the Earth was changing. Slowly, patiently, continents drifted, mountains rose, oceans deepened and shallowed, and life, quietly, persistently, figured out how to survive. But here's what's hard to grasp. None of it was linear. We talk about evolution as if it's a straight line. Fish to amphibians, amphibians to reptiles, reptiles to mammals, a ladder, a progression. But that's not how it works. Evolution is a bush, a sprawling, chaotic tangle of branches. Most of them go nowhere. They grow for a while, then stop. They dead end. They break off. Only a few keep going. The Devonian was filled with experiments. Creatures that tried out body plans that didn't work. Armor that was too heavy. Jaws that were too weak. Lungs that were inefficient. Fins that couldn't support weight. Most of them failed. Most of them left no descendants. They're just fossils now. Hints of what might have been. But a few of them succeeded. A few of them stumbled onto something that worked. Not because they were trying. Not because they were smarter, or stronger, or better. Just because they happened to be in the right place, at the right time, with the right mutation. And those few became everything. Think about Tiktaalik. You might have heard of it. A fossil discovered in the Canadian Arctic in 2004. A creature that lived in the late Devonian, about 375 million years ago. Tiktaalik is famous because it's a transitional fossil, a snapshot of evolution in action. It's not quite a fish. It had scales, it had gills, it had fins, but those fins had bones inside. Bones that look like a shoulder, like an elbow, like a wrist. It could do push-ups. It could prop itself up on the bottom of a shallow stream and look around. It had a neck. Fish don't have necks. They can't turn their heads. But Tiktaalik could. It also had lungs. And it had a flat skull with eyes on top of its head, like a crocodile. It was a predator, an ambush hunter.
Lurking in the shallows, waiting for prey to swim by. But the incredible thing about Tiktaalik isn't just what it looked like. It's what it represents. Because Tiktaalik is a moment frozen in stone. A moment when life was trying something new. When it was testing the boundary between water and land. When it was figuring out, step by step, how to survive in a place where nothing had survived before. Tiktaalik didn't know it was part of a grand transformation. It didn't know it was one link in a chain that would eventually lead to salamanders and lizards and dinosaurs and birds and mammals and you. It was just trying to eat, to avoid being eaten, to reproduce. But in doing so, it crossed a line, and once that line was crossed, there was no going back. Because here's the thing about evolutionary innovation. Once something is invented, it doesn't disappear. It gets repurposed. It gets modified. It gets inherited. The bones in Tiktaalik's fins are the same bones that are in your arms, the same shoulder, the same elbow, the same wrist, the same fingers.
They've been stretched and shortened and reshaped over millions of years, but they're the same bones. You are carrying the Devonian inside you. Every time you pick something up, every time you wave, every time you type or write or touch something, you're using a structure that was invented in a shallow, muddy stream 400 million years ago by a fish that was trying to push itself onto a sandbar. And you never think about it. Because why would you? It's just your hand. It's ordinary. It's mundane. But it's not. It's a miracle. It's the result of 60 million years of trial and error, of mutations and selections and extinctions and survivals, of creatures that lived and died without names, without memory, without any knowledge that they were part of something larger. And yet, here you are, the inheritor of all of it. let's talk about forests again. Because the forests of the Devonian were not like the forests you know. When you think of a forest, you probably think of tall trees with broad leaves, oak, maple, pine. You think of bird song, of sunlight filtering through the canopy, of moss on the forest floor, of the smell of earth and wood. The Devonian forests had none of that. There were no birds, no mammals, no flowers, no grass, no acorns or pine cones. The trees were strange, towering structures that looked more like ferns than anything else. Some of them, like Archaeopteris, had woody trunks and branches covered in small, frond-like leaves. Others, like the giant club mosses and horsetails that would dominate the later Carboniferous, were just beginning to appear. And beneath those trees, the ground was alive, not with animals, not yet, but with fungi. Enormous, sprawling networks of fungal mycelium that stretched for kilometers underground. The largest organisms on the planet at the time weren't plants or animals, they were fungi. Some of them formed massive fruiting bodies, structures called prototaxites that looked like tree trunks, but were actually fungal stalks, growing up to 8 meters tall. Imagine walking through a Devonian forest and seeing these towering pale columns rising out of the ground. Not wood, not stone, just fungus. Silent, ancient, slowly decomposing the dead plant matter that carpeted the forest floor. Because that's what fungi do. They break things down, they recycle, they turn death into soil. And without them, the Devonian forests couldn't have existed. There. Fungi were the architects of the land ecosystem. They still are. And in the Devonian, they were just beginning to form partnerships. Symbiotic relationships with plants. Mycorrhizae. Fungal threads wrapping around plant roots, extending their reach, helping them absorb water and nutrients from the soil. In exchange, the plants provided the fungi with sugars, with energy. It was a trade, a cooperation. And it worked so well that it's still happening today. Almost every plant on Earth has a fungal partner, including the ones outside your window. The Devonian invented that, but the forests didn't just change the land, they changed the sky. They changed the air itself, because plants breathe backward. They take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen. And when the first forests spread across the continents, they started pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Massive amounts of it. And they started releasing oxygen, lots of oxygen. By the end of the Devonian, oxygen levels in the atmosphere were rising. Not to modern levels, not yet, but higher than they'd ever been before. And that had consequences. Higher oxygen levels meant that fires could burn hotter, faster. The first wildfires appeared in the Devonian. Lightning strikes igniting dry plant matter, sweeping through forests, clearing the underbrush. It sounds destructive, and it was. But it was also creative, because fire creates openings. It clears space for new growth. It returns nutrients to the soil. It's part of the cycle. And higher oxygen levels meant that arthropods could grow larger. Insects and spiders and millipedes don't have lungs. They breathe through tiny tubes called tracheae that carry oxygen directly to their tissues. It's efficient, but it has limits. The bigger you are, the harder it is to get oxygen to the center of your body. So arthropods are usually small. But when there's more oxygen in the air, those limits relax. You can be bigger. And in the Devonian, some of them started to take advantage of that. There were millipedes a meter long, scorpions the size of house cats. These weren't dominant animals, not yet, but they were there, creeping through the leaf litter, hunting smaller arthropods, laying the groundwork for the even more gigantic insects that would come in the Carboniferous. The Devonian was a world of firsts. First forests, first wildfires, first soil, first tetrapods, first insects on land, first trees, first lungs, first limbs. But it was also a world of lasts, because the Devonian extinctions didn't just kill off the placoderms and the reef-building organisms. They killed off entire ways of life, entire ecosystems, entire strategies for survival that had worked for hundreds of millions of years. The trilobites, for example, they had been around since the Cambrian, over 300 million years. They had survived multiple extinction events. They had diversified into thousands of species. They had crawled across every ocean floor on the planet, but the Devonian nearly ended them. The extinction pulses hit them hard. By the end of the period, only a handful of trilobite families remained. They would limp along for another 100 million years, but they would never recover their former diversity. They were the walking dead, survivors of a world that no longer existed. And the reefs. The massive, sprawling reefs that had covered the shallow seas, they collapsed. Completely. The organisms that built them went extinct. The ecosystems that depended on them vanished. It would take millions of years for new reef ecosystems to evolve. And when they did, they would be built by different organisms, corals as we know them today, but the Devonian reefs were gone forever. Why does this matter? Why should you care about the extinction of species that lived 400 million years ago? Species you've never heard of, species that left no descendants. Because it's a reminder, a warning, maybe, a pattern. Extinctions are not rare. They're not anomalies. They're part of the rhythm of life on Earth. Species appear, they thrive, they spread, and then, eventually, they disappear. Sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly, but always, inevitably, they vanish. The average lifespan of a species is about 1 million years. Some last longer, some last less. But 1 million years is the average, and there have been billions of species in Earth's history, which means that over 99% of all species that have ever lived are now extinct. You are not living in the world as it has always been. You're living in a snapshot, a single frame in a film that's been running for 4 billion years. And the cast is constantly changing. The Devonian was just one chapter, one frame, but it was the chapter that set the stage for everything that came after. Let's step back. Let's zoom out. Because we've been focused on the details, on the fish and the plants, and the extinctions and the innovations. But there's a bigger picture here, a pattern. The Devonian is part of a sequence, a progression. Not a linear one, but a progression nonetheless. Before the Devonian, there was the Silurian. Before the Silurian, the Ordovician. Before that, the Cambrian. Each period lasting tens of millions of years, each one building on what came before. Each one adding layers of complexity to the story of life on Earth. The Cambrian was when complex animals first appeared. The Ordovician was when they diversified. The Silurian was when plants first colonized the land. And the Devonian was when everything accelerated, when the experiments of the previous periods started to pay off, when the pieces came together. But the Devonian was also a hinge, a turning point, because after the Devonian came the Carboniferous. The age of giant insects and the first reptiles and vast coal swamps. And after the Carboniferous came the Permian, the age of the supercontinent Pangaea and the rise of the synapsids, the ancestors of mammals. And after the Permian came the Triassic, the age of the first dinosaurs. The Devonian sits between the ancient world and the modern world, between a time when life was mostly confined to the oceans and the time when it dominated the land. Between the time when vertebrates were just another type of swimming creature and the time when they became the rulers of the planet. And you are the product of that transition. You are the descendant of the creatures that made it through. The ones that survived the extinctions, the ones that adapted to the changing world, the ones that crawled out of the water and learned to breathe. The Devonian didn't care about you. It didn't care about humans. It didn't care about the future. It was just a period of time, a span of geological history, a collection of ecosystems and species and events. And yet, it shaped everything. Not intentionally, not purposefully, but inevitably. Because evolution is cumulative. Each generation inherits the traits of the previous generation. Each species inherits the body plan of its ancestors. Each ecosystem inherits the structure of the ecosystems that came before. You can't erase the past. You can only build on it. And the Devonian is part of your past, part of your foundation, part of the invisible architecture that holds you up. You just don't see it because it's too deep, too old, too far removed from the surface of the present. But it's there, in your bones, in your breath, in the soil beneath your feet, in the forests outside your window, in the fish in the ocean, in the insects, in the grass. The Devonian is everywhere. You just have to know where to look. And when you do look, when you really see it, something shifts, something in the way you understand the world. Because you realize that the ground beneath your feet is not solid, not permanent, not unchanging. It's a palimpsest, a layered text, written and rewritten over and over again. Each layer telling a story, each layer revealing a world that no longer exists, but that still echoes in the present. The Devonian is one of those layers, one of those echoes, and it's calling to you across 400 million years. Can you hear it? There's a fossil, a small, unassuming thing, found in a layer of red sandstone in Scotland. It's the skeleton of a creature called pedipes. About a meter long, it lived in the late Devonian or early Carboniferous, right around the boundary between the two periods. Pedipes is important because it's one of the earliest tetrapods, one of the first vertebrates to walk on land. It had 4 limbs, 5 toes on each foot, a long tail, a flattened skull. It probably lived in swamps and rivers, hunting fish and invertebrates, spending part of its time in the water and part on land. But here's the thing that gets me. The thing that makes me stop and think. Pedipes didn't know it was making history. It didn't know it was one of the first. It didn't know that millions of years later, creatures like you would dig up its bones and study them and try to understand what it was like to be alive in that moment. It was just living, just surviving, just doing what every creature does, eating, avoiding predators, reproducing, trying to make it to the next day. And in doing so, it became part of a lineage, a thread that stretches from the Devonian swamps to the modern world, a thread that connects pedipes to salamanders and frogs and lizards and crocodiles and birds and mammals. To you, you share a common ancestor with pedipes. It's distant.
Incredibly distant, hundreds of millions of years distant. But it's there. Somewhere in the deep past, there was a creature that was the ancestor of both you and Pedipes. A creature that lived in the Devonian. A creature that had limbs and lungs and a backbone. And that creature, whoever it was, made a choice. Not a conscious choice, not a deliberate one, but a choice nonetheless. It left the water. It walked on land. It breathed air.
And because of that choice, you exist. Pause. Really think about that. Your existence is contingent on a fish crawling out of a swamp 400 million years ago. If that fish had stayed in the water, if it had gone extinct, if it had never evolved lungs or weight-bearing fins, if the environmental pressures had been different, if the oxygen levels hadn't risen, if the plants hadn't colonized the land and created habitats for animals to follow, if any one of 1,000 variables had been different, you wouldn't be here. None of us would. The entire history of terrestrial vertebrate life, including human life, is balanced on the edge of a knife. A series of improbable events, a cascade of accidents, a chain of survivals, and it all traces back to the Devonian. Does that make you feel small? It should, but not in a bad way, not in a diminishing way, because it also makes you part of something vast, something ancient, something that stretches back further than you can imagine, and forward into a future you'll never see. You are a link in a chain, a thread in a tapestry, a note in a song that's been playing for 4 billion years. And the Devonian is where your part of the song began. Let's talk about time again, because I don't think we've really grasped it yet. 60 million years. We keep saying it, but what does it mean? Here's one way to think about it. If you compressed the entire history of the Devonian into a single year, each day would represent about 164,000 years. That's longer than the entire existence of modern humans, every single day. January would be the early Devonian, the world just beginning to green, the first jawed fish spreading through the oceans, the placoderms just starting to dominate. By March, the plants would be growing taller, forests starting to appear, the first arthropods colonizing the land. By June, halfway through the year, Archaeopteryx would be spreading across the continents, the first real forests, the first soil, oxygen levels rising. By September, the lobe-finned fish would be experimenting with air breathing, Tiktaalik and its relatives hauling themselves out of the water. And by December, the extinctions would begin, the reefs collapsing, the placoderms dying off. The world preparing for the transition to the Carboniferous. An entire year, 365 days, and every single day would contain more time than all of human civilization. That's the Devonian. And here's the part that's hard to accept. We know almost nothing about it. We have fossils, lots of them, thousands of species preserved in stone. We have geological evidence, layers of rock that tell us about sea levels and climate and volcanic activity. We have chemical signatures, isotopes that reveal oxygen levels and temperature changes. But we don't have the whole story. We don't even have most of the story, because fossilization is rare, incredibly rare. Most creatures that die don't become fossils. They decompose. They're eaten, they're scattered, their bones crumble into dust. Only under very specific conditions, when a creature is buried quickly in sediment, when the chemistry is just right, when the pressure and temperature are perfect, only then does fossilization occur, and even then, the fossil has to survive. It has to avoid being destroyed by erosion, by tectonic activity, by weathering. It has to sit there, buried in the rock, for millions of years, waiting for someone to find it. And then someone has to find it, which means it has to be exposed, which means the rock has to be uplifted, eroded, brought to the surface. And it has to be in a place where someone is looking, where someone knows what to look for. The odds are astronomical, which means that the fossils we have, the thousands of species we've discovered, represent only a tiny fraction of the life that existed in the Devonian. Most of it is gone, vanished without a trace. No bones, no shells, no imprints, nothing. We are looking at the Devonian through a keyhole, a narrow, distorted view. We see shapes, we see patterns, but we miss most of the details. And yet, even through that keyhole, even with the limited evidence we have, we can see enough to be amazed. We can see the broad strokes, the rise of fish, the colonization of the land, the evolution of forests, the appearance of tetrapods, the extinctions. We can see the trajectory, the direction, the momentum. We can see that the Devonian was a crucible, a forge, a place where life was tested and refined and transformed. And we can see that we are the product of that transformation. But there's so much we don't know, so many questions we can't answer. What did the Devonian sound like? We know there were no birds, no mammals, no frogs, but were there sounds? Did the forests rustle with the movement of giant millipedes? Did the rivers echo with the splashing of tetrapods? Did the oceans rumble with the vibrations of massive placoderms? We don't know. We can guess, we can imagine, but we don't know. What did the Devonian smell like? The scent of decay in the swamps, the sharp mineral smell of exposed rock, the fresh, oxygen-rich air above the forests. We don't know. What colors were the creatures? We can see the shape of their bones, the structure of their shells, but we can't see their skin, their scales, their pigmentation. Were the fish brightly colored, like tropical fish today, or drab and camouflaged? Were the plants green, or some other color entirely? We don't know. These details are lost, forever, erased by the passage of time. And we have to accept that. We have to accept that there are limits to what we can know, limits to what the rocks can tell us. But that doesn't make the Devonian less real. It just makes it more mysterious, more tantalizing. Because the Devonian is not just a collection of facts, it's a reminder that the world has always been stranger than we imagine, that life has always been more creative, more resilient, more adaptable than we give it credit for. The Devonian is proof that the impossible becomes possible, given enough time, given enough pressure, given enough opportunity. Fish learned to walk, plants learned to grow tall, the land learned to sustain life. And 400 million years later, here you are, a descendant of those impossibilities, a creature that exists because the Devonian happened. You are a Devonian echo, a ripple in time, a consequence of events that occurred so long ago that they feel like mythology. But they're not mythology. They're geology, they're paleontology, they're science, and they're real. Let me tell you one more thing, one more piece of the puzzle. The Devonian didn't happen in isolation. It was part of a larger pattern, a cycle. Earth's history is not a smooth, gradual progression. It's punctuated, interrupted. There are long periods of relative stability, where ecosystems are established and species diversify and life settles into a rhythm. And then there are disruptions, extinctions, climate shifts, volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts. Events that throw everything into chaos, that reset the board, that force life to adapt or die. The Devonian experienced both. Long stretches of stability, where fish and plants and arthropods spread and diversified. And then, at the end, a series of extinction pulses that wiped out huge percentages of species. And after each disruption, life rebuilt. It filled the empty niches. It evolved new forms. But this pattern repeats throughout Earth's history. This pattern repeats throughout Earth's history. Stability, disruption, recovery. Stability, disruption, recovery. And we're living in one of those cycles right now. In a period of relative stability, but also, increasingly, in a period of disruption. Because humans are changing the planet rapidly, dramatically. We're altering the climate. We're driving species to extinction. We're transforming ecosystems. We're reshaping the surface of the Earth. And in doing so, we're creating the conditions for the next great shift, the next transition, the next chapter in Earth's history. What that chapter will look like, we don't know. We can guess, we can model, we can predict, but we don't know. Because the future is unwritten, it's contingent. It depends on choices, on actions, on events that haven't happened yet, but the past is written. It's fixed. It's carved into stone. And the Devonian is one of the clearest chapters in that stone. One of the most important, one of the most transformative, because the Devonian is the chapter where the Earth learned to be a living planet. Not just a planet with life, but a planet shaped by life. A planet where life and geology and climate are intertwined, where they influence each other, where they co-evolve. The Devonian forests changed the atmosphere. They lowered carbon dioxide levels. They raised oxygen levels. They altered the climate. The Devonian tetrapods changed the land. They burrowed, they trampled, they ate. They became part of the nutrient cycle. The Devonian fish changed the oceans. They created new food webs, new predator-prey relationships, new ecosystems. And all of these changes fed back into each other. The forests created habitats for arthropods and tetrapods. The tetrapods spread seeds and spores. The fish recycled nutrients. The climate shifts triggered evolutionary innovations. It was a system, a feedback system, and it's still running. The Earth you live on is not a static object. It's a dynamic, living system. A system that has been shaped by billions of years of life. A system that is still being shaped. And you are part of that system. You are not separate from it. You are not outside it. You are embedded in it. You are a participant. Just like the Devonian fish, just like the Devonian plants, just like every creature that has ever lived. You are part of the story. And the Devonian is where your part of the story became possible. So when you walk on the ground, remember that the ground has a memory, that it remembers the Devonian forests, the Devonian swamps, the Devonian seas. When you breathe, remember that the air you're breathing was transformed by Devonian plants, that it carries the legacy of those ancient forests. When you move your arms, your legs, remember that the bones inside them were invented in the Devonian, that they were prototyped by fish trying to crawl out of the water. You are not just a person, you are a collection of Devonian inventions. You are a walking museum of ancient innovations. And that should fill you with something. Not pride, necessarily. You didn't earn it, you didn't create it, but awe, wonder, humility, because you are part of something so much larger than yourself, something so much older, something so much more enduring. You are a temporary expression of a pattern that has been running for 400 million years, a pattern that started in the Devonian and continues today. And that pattern will continue long after you're gone, long after your children's children's children are gone, long after humanity itself is gone. Because life doesn't end. It changes, it adapts, it moves on. Just like it did after the Devonian extinctions, just like it has after every extinction, just like it will after the next one. The Earth is patient. It's resilient, it's creative, and the Devonian is proof of that. So here we are, at the end of this journey, this long, slow walk through a world that no longer exists. We've seen the oceans teeming with armored fish. We've seen the first forests rising on barren continents. We've seen creatures crawling out of the water, gasping for air, learning to walk. We've seen extinctions and innovations, collapses and recoveries, endings and beginnings. And through it all, we've seen one thing clearly. The Devonian was not just a period in Earth's history. It was a transformation, a threshold, a moment when the planet crossed from one state to another. Before the Devonian, Earth was a water world, a planet of oceans and barren rock. After the Devonian, Earth was a living world, a planet of forests and soil and creatures that could walk and breathe and see the sky. And that transformation echoes through everything that came after, through every ecosystem, every species, every individual organism, including you. You are standing on ground that was built in the Devonian. You are breathing air that was transformed in the Devonian. You are using structures that were invented in the Devonian. And you probably never think about it, but maybe you should. Not all the time, not obsessively, but sometimes, because there's something profound about understanding where you come from, about understanding the deep history of the world you inhabit, about understanding that the present is not separate from the past, but built on it. The Devonian is not ancient history. It's your history. It's the history of every vertebrate on the planet. It's the foundation of a modern world, and it's still here. In the rocks, in the fossils, in the DNA coiled inside your cells. You just have to know where to look. And when you do look, when you really see it, something changes. You start to see the world differently, not as a static backdrop, but as a living, evolving system. A system with a history. A system with a future. You start to see yourself differently. Not as separate from nature, but as part of it, a product of it, an expression of it. You start to see time differently, not as a linear progression from past to future, but as a vast, interconnected web, where the past shapes the present and the present shapes the future. And you start to feel something that's hard to describe, a sense of connection, of continuity, of belonging. You are not alone. You are not isolated. You are not separate. You are part of a lineage that stretches back 400 million years. A lineage of survivors, of innovators, of adapters. And that lineage will continue long after you, long after humanity, long after anything you can imagine. Because life is persistent, life is creative, life is resilient, and the Devonian proved it. So the next time you're outside, walking on the ground, breathing the air, feeling the sun on your face, take a moment, just a moment, and think about the Devonian. Think about the fish that crawled out of the water, the plants that grew into forests, the extinctions that cleared the way for new beginnings. Think about the 60 million years of struggle and adaptation and survival. Think about the fact that you are here because of all of that. Because of a series of improbable events, a chain of accidents and innovations and survivals. And feel it. Feel the weight of that history, the depth of that time, the vastness of that transformation, and then let it go. Because the Devonian is not a burden, it's not a weight to carry, it's a gift, an inheritance, a foundation. It's the ground beneath your feet, and it will hold you up, just like it's held up every creature that came after, every tetrapod, every vertebrate, every mammal, every one of us. We are all Devonian children. And the world we live in is the Devonian's gift. So take care of it, appreciate it, understand it. Because it's the only world we have. And it's been a long, long time in the making. 400 million years, and counting. The silence of deep time is deafening. That's the thought that keeps recurring when you try to hold the Devonian in your mind. Not just the length of it, not just the 60 million years, but the silence, the absolute, utter absence of witnesses. No one was there to see it, no one was there to record it, no consciousness existed that could comprehend what was happening. The fish didn't know they were making history. The plants didn't know they were transforming a planet. The continents drifted without anyone noticing. Mountains rose and eroded without names. Oceans deepened without maps. It all happened in silence, in darkness, in a world completely indifferent to its own significance. And yet, it mattered. More than almost anything else in Earth's history, the Devonian mattered, because it set the template. It established the rules. It created the possibilities that everything else would build on. But here's what haunts me. Here's what I can't shake. The Devonian almost didn't happen. Think about it. Really think about it. The transition from water to land required so many things to align, so many variables to fall into place, so many accidents to happen in just the right sequence. If the moon had been slightly closer or farther away, the tides would have been different. The tidal pools where early fish learned to survive out of water might not have existed, or they might have been too harsh, too brief, too unpredictable. If Earth's rotation had been different, the day-night cycle would have been different, the temperature swings would have been different, the conditions for survival on land would have been different. If the oxygen levels hadn't risen at exactly the right rate, plants couldn't have grown tall enough to create forests, and without forests, there would have been no soil, no moisture retention, no stable habitats for tetrapods to colonize. If volcanic activity had been too intense or too mild, the climate would have been wrong, too hot or too cold, too stable or too chaotic. If the asteroid impacts had been more frequent, life might never have had the stability it needed to make the transition. If the extinction events had hit harder or earlier, the lineages that led to tetrapods might have been wiped out before they could evolve. Every single one of these factors was contingent, dependent on cosmic accidents, on the initial conditions of the solar system, on the placement of Earth in its orbit, on the composition of the planet's interior, on the impact that created the moon, on the timing of meteorite bombardments, on atmospheric chemistry, on ocean currents, on plate tectonics. Change any one of them, and the Devonian doesn't happen, not the way it did. And if the Devonian doesn't happen the way it did, then you don't happen. None of us do. There might still be life on Earth, probably would be, but it would be different, fundamentally different. Maybe the oceans would still teem with fish, but they'd be stuck there. forever aquatic, never developing the innovations that led to amphibians, reptiles, mammals. Maybe plants would have colonized the land eventually, but without the specific conditions of the Devonian, they might have evolved differently. Different structures, different strategies, different ecosystems. Maybe intelligence would have emerged somewhere, somehow, but not in primates, not in mammals, maybe in some entirely different lineage. Or maybe in some entirely different lineage, or maybe not at all. The point is this: the Devonian was not inevitable. It was not predetermined. It was not part of some grand plan or design. It was an accident, a beautiful, intricate, monumentally important accident. And that should change how you see everything. Because if the Devonian was an accident, then so are you. Your existence is not guaranteed. It's not written into the fabric of the universe. It's the result of a chain of improbable events that could have broken at any point. And yet, here you are, against all odds, against astronomical probabilities. Here you are. And that's not a comforting thought, necessarily. It's not meant to be. It's meant to be humbling, sobering, awe-inspiring in the truest sense of the word. You exist because a fish crawled out of the water. And that fish exists because plants oxygenated the atmosphere. And those plants exist because fungi helped them survive. And the fungi exist because the chemistry of early Earth allowed complex organic molecules to form. And that chemistry exists because Earth is the right distance from the Sun. And Earth is the right distance because of the way the solar system formed. And the solar system formed because a cloud of gas and dust collapsed under its own gravity. And that cloud existed because stars before our sun lived and died and scattered heavy elements into space. You are the product of billions of years of cosmic accidents. And the Devonian is just one link in that chain. But it's the link that made you possible. The link that made terrestrial vertebrate life possible. Without it, the chain breaks, and you disappear. So when I say the Devonian matters, I don't just mean it matters historically. I don't just mean it's interesting, or important, or worth studying. I mean it matters existentially. It matters to the very fact of your being. It matters to the question of why you're here at all. And that's a heavy thing to carry. But it's also a strange kind of gift. Because it means you're connected to everything. To the rocks, to the trees, to the fish in the ocean, to the air you breathe, to the stars that made the atoms in your body. You're not separate. You're not isolated. You're not a stranger in a strange land. You're part of the pattern, part of the process, part of the great unfolding of matter and energy and information that we call life. And the Devonian is part of your origin story. Let's zoom out again. Let's call back even further, because we've been focused on Earth, on the Devonian, on the specific events that happened in this particular place at this particular time. But Earth is not alone. It's not unique. It's one planet orbiting, one star in one galaxy among billions of galaxies. And that raises a question that the Devonian makes more pointed, more urgent. Is the Devonian unique? Has this transition this movement from ocean to land, this evolution of complex multicellular life that can survive in multiple environments. Has this happened elsewhere? Are there other Devonians, on other planets, in other solar systems, in other galaxies? We don't know. We can't know. Not yet. We haven't found life anywhere else. We've barely even looked. But we can think about it. We can wonder. We can extrapolate. Because if the Devonian was an accident, a contingent series of events that could have gone differently, then maybe it's rare. Maybe the specific conditions required for life to make the transition from water to land are so precise, so demanding, that they almost never occur. Maybe we're alone, or nearly alone. Maybe the universe is full of planets with oceans and simple life, but almost none of them make it to the next level. Almost none of them develop the complexity, the diversity, the innovation required for land colonization. Or maybe not. Maybe the Devonian, or something like it, is common. Maybe given enough time, given the right conditions, life always finds a way to spread, to explore new environments, to adapt to new challenges. Maybe the universe is full of forests and soil and creatures that breathe air. Maybe there are thousands of planets where air is bad and bad contains. Maybe the universe is full and planet contains more, where ecosystems became complex and interconnected. We don't know, and that's the most honest answer I can give you. But here's what the Devonian teaches us. Here's the lesson that applies whether we're alone or not. Life is not passive. It's not static. It doesn't just exist. It doesn't just wait for conditions to be perfect. Life pushes, it explores, it experiments, it takes risks. The fish that crawled out of the water in the Devonian weren't responding to a clear opportunity. They weren't following a safe, well-lit path. They were venturing into the unknown, into an environment that was harsh, unforgiving, completely alien to everything their ancestors had ever experienced. And most of them failed. Most of them died. Most of the lineages that tried to colonize the land went extinct without leaving descendants. But a few made it. A few succeeded. And those few changed everything. That's how evolution works. That's how innovation works. That's how life works. Not through careful planning, not through guaranteed success, but through trial and error, through exploration and failure and occasional unpredictable success. And that pattern is not limited to biology. It applies to everything. Where we might find muse and character for our beings, to human endeavor, to scientific discovery, to artistic creation, to personal growth, you have to be willing to fail, to take risks, to venture into the unknown, because the alternative is stagnation, is staying safe, is remaining in the water while the land waits, empty and full of possibility. The Devonian fish didn't know they were making history. They didn't know they were setting the stage for everything that would come after. They just moved forward, and in doing so, they created the future. Maybe that's what we're supposed to learn from the Devonian. Not just facts, not just timelines and species names and extinction events, but a way of seeing, a way of understanding our place in the universe. We are not the culmination of evolution. We are not the end point. We are not the final product. We are just another step, another experiment, another lineage trying to survive in a changing world. And just like the Devonian fish, we have a choice. We can stay where we are, comfortable, safe, familiar, or we can venture forward, into the unknown, into the uncertain, into the future, and maybe we'll fail. Probably will fail. Most lineages do, but maybe we won't. Maybe we'll succeed. Maybe we'll become something new. Something that future creatures, billions of years from now, will look back on and study and wonder about. Maybe we'll be their Devonian, their origin story, their foundation. Or maybe we'll just be one more fossil layer, one more failed experiment, one more dead end. Either way, the pattern continues. The process goes on. Life endures, just like it did after the Devonian extinctions, just like it has after every catastrophe, just like it will after whatever comes next. There's something comforting in that, something reassuring. Not because it means we're guaranteed to survive. We're not. But because it means life is guaranteed to survive in some form, in some lineage, somewhere. The pattern is bigger than us, older than us, more resilient than us. And the Devonian proved it. I want to tell you about a place, a real place, a place you can go if you want, if you're willing to make the journey. It's called Migwasha, a small park in eastern Canada, on the coast of Quebec, overlooking the Gaspé Peninsula. It doesn't look like much. Rocky cliffs, gray stone, waves lapping against the shore, trees swaying in the wind. But those cliffs are special. Those layers of rock are special because they're Devonian, late Devonian, about 380 million years old, and preserved in those rocks, in stunning detail, are the fossils of fish, hundreds of them, thousands of them. Complete skeletons, perfect impressions, fish frozen in time, in the moment of their death, in the mud of an ancient estuary. Not directly, not in a straight line, but Eustinopteron is your cousin, separated by hundreds of millions of years and countless branching lineages, but still family. You share a common ancestor. Somewhere in the Devonian seas, there was a fish that was the grandmother of both you and Eustinopteron. And that fish passed something down, a body plan, a set of genes, a potential. And here you are, descendant of that potential, standing on the shore, looking back at your own history. It's a strange feeling, standing in a place like Migwasha, looking at fossils that are older than mountains, older than continents, older than almost anything you can see on the surface of the earth, because it makes time tangible. It makes deep history real. These aren't abstract numbers. They're not theoretical constructs. They're rocks, fossils, physical objects you can touch. The Devonian is real. It happened. It's not a story. It's not a myth. It's geology. It's paleontology. It's truth. And that truth is written in stone, in layers of sediment, in the crushed and mineralized remains of creatures that lived and died before anything you would recognize as familiar existed. And it's still there, waiting, patient, silent. You can visit it, you can see it, you can stand in front of it and let it speak to you across the vastness of time. And what it says is simple. You are not separate from this. You are part of this. You are continuation of this. The Devonian is not the past. Not really. It's the foundation. The roots, the beginning. And it's still here, in you, in every vertebrate on the planet. The Devonian never ended. It just transformed. It became the Carboniferous, which became the Permian, which became the Triassic, which became everything that followed. Each period building on the last. Each one inheriting the innovations of the one before. But the Devonian was special. The Devonian was the moment when the fundamental architecture was established, when the blueprint was drawn. Everything else has just been variations on a theme. Elaborations, refinements. The basic plan, the basic structure was set in the Devonian. 4 limbs, a backbone, lungs, jaws, a skull. These are Devonian inventions, and they've never been replaced, only modified. Birds didn't invent a new way to be vertebrates. They took the Devonian plan and turned the 4 limbs into wings. Whales didn't invent a new way to be vertebrates. They took the Devonian plan and returned to the water, turning the limbs into flippers. Snakes didn't invent a new way to be vertebrates. They took the Devonian plan and reduced the limbs to nothing, but kept the backbone, the skull, the basic architecture. Every variation, every adaptation, every species of tetrapod that has ever existed has been working within the constraints established in the Devonian. The Devonian set the boundaries, and we've never escaped them. We've never needed to. Because the Devonian plan works, it's flexible, it's adaptable, it can be modified in countless ways to suit countless environments. But it's still the same plan, still the same foundation, and that tells us something profound about evolution, about innovation, about the nature of life itself. Once a good solution is found, it persists, it gets reused, it gets modified, but not replaced. Evolution is conservative. It doesn't start from scratch every time. It builds on what came before. It inherits, it modifies, it tinkers, and the Devonian gave it something worth keeping, something worth building on, a body plan that could walk and swim and eventually fly. A respiratory system that could breathe air and eventually support high metabolism. A skeletal system that could support weight and eventually allow for enormous size. The Devonian gave evolution a toolkit, and that toolkit has been used ever since. You are using it right now, as you read this, as you breathe, as you sit or stand or move. You are a Devonian creation, a 400 million year old design, still running, still functional, still adapting. And that should fill you with something, some emotion that doesn't quite have a name. Not pride, you didn't do anything to earn this. Not gratitude, the Devonian didn't create you. Intentionally doesn't create you. Some sense of connection to the deep patterns of existence. You are ancient, older than you know, older than you can comprehend. Your body plan is 400 million years old. Your genes carry sequences that are even older. Your cells use molecular machinery that dates back billions of years. You are new, fresh, individual, unique, but you are also old, ancient, a continuation of lineages that stretch back to the beginning of life itself. And the Devonian is one of the chapters in that story, one of the pivotal chapters, one of the chapters that changed everything. So remember it, honor it, understand it, not because you owe it anything, but because understanding where you come from helps you understand who you are. And who you are is a temporary expression of a very old pattern, a pattern that was refined and established in the Devonian, a pattern that continues today, a pattern that will continue long after you're gone. The sun is setting on the Devonian, not literally. There's no single moment when it ended, but metaphorically, conceptually. We're coming to the close of this exploration, and I want to leave you with one final thought, one final image. Imagine a river, a slow, meandering river, cutting through a landscape of low hills. The water is warm, shallow, clear. Along the banks, strange trees rise. Not trees as you know them, but something close, something trying to be trees. Their trunks are thick, their branches spread wide, their leaves, or whatever they are, catch the light. Beneath them, the ground is carpeted with moss and primitive plants. Insects, large and strange, crawl through the undergrowth. Millipedes, as long as your arm, wind between the roots. In the water, fish swim. Some are small, darting between the stones. Others are large, predatory, cruising slowly through the deeper pools. And there, at the edge, where the water meets the land, something moves. It's not quite a fish, not quite anything else. It has 4 limbs, stubby, awkward, but functional. It drags itself out of the water onto a muddy bank. It pauses, breathing hard, gulping air. It's not comfortable here. This is not its natural environment, but it can survive for a few minutes, maybe longer. It looks around, sees the forest, sees the insects, sees possibilities it doesn't understand. And then it slides back into the water, disappears beneath the surface. But it will return. It, or its descendants, they really find the truth. That moment, that small, ungraceful movement from water to land, is the Devonian. That's what it was. That's what it meant. Not a grand drama, not a sudden transformation. Just a small step, repeated over and over, across millions of years, across thousands of generations, until the impossible became possible, until the alien became familiar, until the future became the present. And that's how change happens, not through revolutions, not through sudden leaps, but through small steps, incremental movements, gradual accumulations. The Devonian didn't change the world in a day. It changed the world over 60 million years, one generation at a time, one mutation at a time, one small adaptation at a time. And those small changes added up. They compounded, they built on each other, until the world was transformed, until fish became tetrapods, until barren rock became forests, until the impossible became real. That's the lesson. That's what the Devonian teaches us. Change is possible. Even enormous, fundamental, transformative change. But it takes time. It takes patience. It takes persistence. And it takes a willingness to take that first step, even when you don't know where it leads, even when it's awkward and uncomfortable and uncertain. Because that's how the future gets made, not through certainty, not through guarantees, but through exploration, through risk, through the courage to try something new. The Devonian fish that first crawled onto land had no idea what they were doing. They had no vision of the future. They were just trying to survive. But in trying to survive, they created possibilities. They opened doors. They made the future possible. And we are that future. We are the realization of possibilities that were opened 400 million years ago. And we, in turn, are opening possibilities for the future, for whatever comes next, for whatever creatures will exist millions of years from now. We don't know what that future holds. We can't know. The future is always uncertain, but we can know this. We can know that the pattern continues, that life persists, that innovation happens, that change is possible, because we've seen it before. In the Devonian, and in every period since, life doesn't give up. It doesn't surrender. It adapts. It survives. It finds a way. And that's the real message of the Devonian. Not the specific events, not the species names, not the dates and the timelines, but the pattern, the persistence, the resilience. Life endures, even through extinctions, even through catastrophes, even through changes so profound they seem impossible. Life endures. And you are proof of that. You are the descendant of survivors, of innovators, of creatures that refuse to give up, that kept trying, that kept exploring, that kept adapting. And that legacy lives in you, in your genes, in your body, in your very existence. You are a Devonian fish that learned to walk. You are a plant that learned to grow tall. You are an experiment that succeeded. And the experiment continues through you, through your children, through every generation that follows. The Devonian is not over. It never ended. It just became us. And now, at the end of this journey, at the end of this long meditation on deep time and ancient seas and the origins of everything familiar, I want to leave you with silence. Not because there's nothing left to say. There's always more to say, more to discover, more to understand, but because silence is where understanding deepens. Silence is where the patterns settle. Silence is where you feel the weight and the wonder of what you've learned. So be silent for a moment. Sit with it. Let the Devonian wash over you. Let the 60 million years sink in. Let the fish and the forests and the extinctions and the survivals become real. And then, when you're ready, go outside, touch the ground, look at the trees, watch the birds, feel the air, and know that all of it, every bit of it, is connected to you, to the Devonian, to the deep history of this planet. You are standing on ancient ground, breathing ancient air, living in a world that too